So now we're going to talk about fertilizers this afternoon, and then we're going to talk about the ways to monitor things. Okay? So it's going to take a while because we're going to do some hands-on stuff. We have time. Ask questions as we go. So we covered all this, essential nutrients and nutrient uptake processes. We know how it works. You're going to be able to call up the UCNFA website, get to talk, and have the slides. And you have these cheat sheets, so it's going to help you with all this. Now we're going to talk about fertilizer types today, and then we're going to talk about monitoring the crop fertility status. And basically, not just about fertilizer management, but cultural practices that can help you with this, because it's about keeping root integrity, right? You know that the roots are important, so all the money is in the roots. So keeping a good, healthy root system is really important. So we'll hit on all that. So the fertilizer types first. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the sources of fertilizers and their formulations, because there's a lot of variability in them, and there's a lot of variability in the price. And part of that is due to the type of chemicals that are used, or minerals that are used to make these fertilizers. Some of them are more expensive, some of them are less expensive. The ground up rock, less expensive. And when you start making synthetic stuff, it costs more money. And as energy prices go up, it costs more money to make some fertilizers. And that's why there's differences. And then we're going to break it down this way. We're going to talk about soluble fertilizers, because there's that, where you put things into your water. And then there's the granular types, and we have all kinds of granular types. Like ground up rock, we have coated materials that help with release based on temperature or biological processes. So understanding how they work and how they sometimes don't work is going to be important. And then organic fertilizers, because the consumer is now wanting organic. And so we're going to talk about organic kind of in a way, not necessarily organic, but a manure would be considered organic, I think. So we're going to talk about this. So on the monitoring the crop fertility status, we're going to break it down into 3 different things. We're going to talk about our irrigation water first, what to look for in the water, how to manage it, how to monitor it. And then we're going to talk about the media. We'll talk a little bit about the soils, not as much as we probably would like. I apologize for that. And then we're going to talk about tissue testing. When we have to get to that point, what do we have to do? And how do we do it? So fertilizer types. So the sources and formulations. So one thing I want to point out today, before we begin on this part, is that this is a graph, and this basically is a generalization of plant growth. And then when you have low fertilizer, the deficient amount, inadequate amount, and a toxic amount. And so when you have a deficient amount of fertilizer, I had this bar down here along the x-axis, low, medium, and high, and that's the fertilizer amount. So when you have a plant that's deficient in nutrients, it has a compromised root system. So if you go in and you fertilize something a lot with too much fertilizer and the root systems aren't developed yet, you're going to have a potential for leaching. And back in the early part of the decade, we were talking, early part of 2000s, we were talking about nitrate leaching. That was a big problem, nitrate runoff. And so we weren't only educating growers, nursery people, we were educating the agencies that were regulating us because they also needed to learn about how things work and how fertilizers work in agricultural systems. So if you start off with a plant that's already inadequate in terms of its health, and this may be low fertility, this may be a disease issue, right? I always tell people, if you go into the hospital and you have, you're operated on, and say, you have, your tonsils taken out or something, or you have your stomach stable. So they don't come in there the next day and serve you a burrito for breakfast, right? Your digestive tract has been compromised, right? So they got to start you with an IV, get the nutrients in some other way. And so plants are the same way. When you have a compromised root system, whether it's pathogens, insects, or what have you, transplanting and it's in your root system, it doesn't have the ability to take up all that fertilizer if you put it in there. So there's a great potential for nutrient leaching in that plant. Then you get into this range where you have a healthy plant, and you fertilize and you have enough fertilizer to meet the needs of the plant. Then you get up into here, and you see there's no difference between the plant that's growing with this amount of fertilizer and this amount of fertilizer. And we call that the area of luxury consumption, because it does not really change the health of the plant. What it may do is it may reduce the productivity of the plant if you're growing fruit crops, because if you have a lot of, especially nitrogen, you can get more vegetative growth than you can fruit growth. You see that in tomatoes a lot. So that's called the area of luxury consumption. But then you get beyond that, you get into the toxic range. And what happens is you get salt toxicity, you get root burn, and so you end up you compromise the plant by having too much fertilizer salts in your system. This can be really tricky, especially here in this region of the state, because we have really salty water down in this region. And so this becomes more of a problem, especially when you're liquid feeding, injecting into the fertilizer into your waters, because our salts are already at 1.2 EC. And so you start adding fertilizer, then you're up to 2, right? Not so much a problem as Dr. Oki was talking earlier with like boron toxicity in the spring, right? You had all the winter rains leaching all the boron out, and then you start adding the water with high boron, and it starts accumulating in the system. We kind of have that same thing here. We can get away with certain stuff earlier on in the season after a good winter rain, but if we're out in the field and we start putting on the fertilizer, now we get salt accumulation as the days progress, and it gets worse in the summer than it would in the winter. So that's a generalization. So the other thing I talked about earlier was it's not only about the amount, but the balance of all of them with each other. So because even though we said earlier that there is mechanisms in the plants for the cells to take up certain nutrients, the machinery is not perfect, and it can be messed with and played with and messed up. So we have to keep that in mind when we make these formulations. And a lot of the fertilizer companies have been around quite a while, and they've worked with this, and they've made different formulations to meet the needs of different plant types, like the palm specials or the acid-loving plants. So they go with more ammoniacal forms of nitrogen to keep that acid thing going on in the soil. So you have that going on. And then the other thing that a lot of the fertilizer companies will do is, depending on the longevity of your crop, the tree people are growing perennial woody trees. And then we have, is anyone doing bed production, liner production? Like, okay, no one's doing annuals. So you have a crop. Some of our growers are on 4-week cycles. They're growing bedding plants, and 4 weeks they're out the door. So you got to get the fertilizer to those young plants when they're there, and then get them out. But they're young plants, they're babies. So not only are you trying to get fertilizer to these young actively growing plants, but they're very sensitive to too much fertilizer. They burn more than, say, something like a citrus tree or a 24-inch box that's been in the ground for a lot longer, has a more mature root system. And younger plants, just like children, it's a problem. You have to work with low fertility to get the fertility in the plants. So we have this good ratio that's going on, and we have to keep that in mind when we're developing our programs. So when you talk about fertilizer sources of any specific element, there's a couple things you have to think about. One is the solubility, okay? How soluble is this fertilizer? Do I want something that's quick, or do I want something that's more slow release? So solubility. So when we talk about the chelates later, we'll talk about chelates, iron chelate, for example, versus iron sulfates or iron oxides. So these have iron oxide has a very low solubility, so it breaks down very slowly, which is good for a longer term crop as long as there's adequate iron coming into the system for the plant to take up. But oftentimes we're in soils that are very disagreeable with the solubility of irons, so we come in with iron chelates. And chelates are a synthetic compound that basically is like a claw that holds onto the iron and keeps it in solution. And so the plant can still take it up, but it keeps it from precipitating out with things like phosphorus. So that's where chelates come in, and we'll talk about those in a little more detail. And so they're more expensive, but they have a purpose, depending on the plant system you're working with, whether you need to do that or not. Then the pH stability is another thing that we have to think about when we look at fertilizers. What pH are you looking for your crop? What are you trying to shoot for? You know, if you do nitrates or calcium carbonates, they're going to increase the pH, right? And in media, in the field soils, you guys are lucky. You're the only two growers with field soils. Who else is growing in the field? Disney's growing in the field. Well, I don't know. You artificial substrate. We know. Yeah. We've been there. No, but yeah, it's kind of
there.
It's there and it's not there.
Yeah.
So, but you're the only two, right? Okay. So the avocado guy, Doug and Richard. Richard's avocados, Doug is citrus and other things, right? So they're lucky because they have a buffer, what we call buffer capacity. Their soils are a little more forgiving. And when we grow in artificial media, it's less forgiving. It doesn't have the buffer capacity. So we have to find kind of a way to figure that in and work that into our system. So, but because we don't have buffering capacity, our pH can go up and down based on what we do to the system, what type of fertilizer we use. So, and they're less so. I mean, yes, but less so. And so what happens is we focus on nitrates and carbonates, our pH is going to go up. And keep in mind, when we talk today, later, we talk about water quality, we've got a thing called alkalinity, which is the amount of carbonates dissolved in water. And that can get the pH going up real high. And so now we've got to deal with the pH issue. We have to deal with having calcium and magnesium in our systems. And we have to deal with acidification of water. So we've got the media thing going on, where we need calcium and magnesium, and we need a little buffer, but then we have water with really high alkalinity. And we kind of need both. We've got to figure out how to make that happen, right? We've got to add calcium to our media, but yet not make the pH go up too high because we're taking it out in the water. So it's a little tricky, but it's fixable. So ammonium urea and aluminum sulfates will decrease the pH. If you're growing hydrangeas, right? If you go with the aluminum sulfates, you get a hydrangea that's bluer. And then if you go with a higher pH, you get the pink. I think I got that right. Did I get that right? I think so.
I think so.
Yeah. And then nutrient interactions. So we've got solubility, pH stability once it's in there. Now we've got interactions with the nutrients. So we have to deal with mixing and storing of nutrients. If you're talking liquid feed, some nutrients are not compatible with others, and you mix them together, they're going to precipitate out, and you've lost all that fertilizer because it's not going to be used. And then the mixing and storing, not only for the liquid feed, but for the granular. So you have to, with liquid feed, you're going to have stock solutions, right? You're going to have tanks. So you're going to have one type of fertilizer in one tank, and you may have another type of fertilizer in another tank, like the chelates, for example. And you may have acidification in another tank. You can't put all three of those together. It's going to end up with a mess. You're going to have a nice slime at the bottom of your tank, and that's going to be all your iron and micronutrients. It's going to be a mess. So you have to keep those separate. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. Phosphates and sulfate fertilizers may precipitate with calcium fertilizers. Irons will also precipitate out. And when we get to the chelates, I'm going to talk about how those have pH margins of error. You can use certain chelates for certain pH regimes, and you have to be really careful on which ones you choose. And some of them that are more flexible in their pH range are usually more expensive. So you got that going on. And then, as I said, use and storage of chelate solutions in water for popular pH range. The other thing with chelates is they are very light sensitive, so They will react with light and they'll precipitate out, basically denature them. So that claw that holds them on and the configuration of that claw gets, and then it can no longer do the job of holding onto that nutrient. So light can be an issue during mixing it. Solubility, pH stability, nutrient interactions. Any questions? You're too quiet. Okay, so let's talk about chelates. So the chelates, as I said earlier, there's a group of chelates. I don't know if you can see this. When you pull up the slides, you'll be able to see it better. But these are different types of chelates. This one column here in this table is the type of chelate: CDTA, DTPA, EDDHA, EDTA, EGTA, HEDTA. And that's what's spelled out, that's what they mean. That's what their words are. That's their chemical structure. That's their chemical formula. That's their molecular weight. And here's their formation constants. What does that mean? It's a half an hour before lunch and he wants me to think about formation constants. So formation constants is basically the ability of that claw to hold on to that element, okay? So the higher the formation constant, the higher the affinity is for that claw to grab onto that ion, okay? So for CDTA, the formation constant for iron is 29, for copper it's 22, for zinc it's 19, 20, and for manganese it's 17. So what does that mean? So what that means is if you have a chelate that's made with CDTA and it has iron in it, okay, and the plant takes up the iron, so you still have this chelate that's functional, okay? There's still a spot there, and it can still bind with other nutrients. It's going to have a greater affinity to bind with any other irons in the system than it would with the manganese that's in the system. But it still has the ability to do that, okay? So that's what that means. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So now we have another column here. It's called the chelate, iron chelate pH stability range. So iron is going to be used as our standard for this. I'm looking at the different chelates. And so the pH stability range is, we have a lower limit and we have an upper limit. And you can see CDTA, which is our first one here, the lower limit where that chelate, the stability of it, will be maintained and it will still work is 4. When you start going below that, it denatures. Just like an egg denatures when you fry it with protein, it turns from liquid to solid. It's a denaturing process. So the same thing happens with this chelate, but in this case, the claw gets deformed, and so below 4, it no longer can bind onto the iron. But its upper limit is 7.0 to 7.5, so you have a better pH range here for this one, say than this one here. Here's HEDTA, the bottom one, and the iron chelate pH stability range only goes down to 4.8. And it only stays up, goes up to 6.7. But fortunately, that chelate is a little less expensive than some of the other ones. So yes, you're paying for a broader range of pH stability when you're usually buying a chelate. Okay. So looking at the chelate formulations, and when you buy a package, look and see what type of chelate is in there, and see what the stability constant is. If you're dealing with a lower pH range, you can use EGTA, because it goes from 4.0 to 5.2, which is really low. But for some of your acid-loving plants, it works, right? That's perfectly fine. You can see that most of them, though, they are anything below 4 is the pH stability is not there. They will just denature. And I got to tell you, if you go below 4, we gotta talk, because that's just way too low. And you know where people make the mistake with this one? With this, it's not that their system is pH 4 or lower, it's that they're trying to mix the chelates in with their acidification chemical. And so they put it in a stock tank and it's down like 2 and it's over. And so what you'll see when you go and clean out this tank, when you start seeing your plants being iron chlorotic, which we know is in growth, what you'll see is you'll see a tank that will have kind of like an orangish slime at the bottom of it, and that's your chelate precipitating out. And that's why you have chlorosis in your plants and an orange slime on the bottom of your stock tank. So that's why that's a problem and why you should not mix chelates with your acidification plants. Also keeping them in a dark place so that you don't have light. Light's going to do the same thing. That's for all of them. So that's uniform for any of the chelates. Even when you mix them, you have to be careful with that. So the upper limit, this has a higher pH range, CDTA, DTPA, higher pH range, so you may pay a little more for that. And then here's EDDHA. I think I've seen that a lot in some of the chemicals, and it's a really high pH, 9.0. And then these other ones are really low. So yes, they cost money, but they do serve a purpose. They do help. Yes.
How long are they viable for? Is it just one application? Because you said once it diffuses one iron, it'll pick up a new one.
Oh yeah.
How long will it do that for?
I'm not. So chelates are pretty stable as long as they don't have light. So if they're in the soil, they're very stable. And while that's a great thing, it's becoming not a great thing because what's happening? Yeah, right.
It's one of those.
A double-edged sword. Yeah. What's happening with this is that the chelates, because of their stability, chelates are used in not just fertilizers. They're used in medicines. They're very, very applicable to many different things, in foods and stuff. So what's happening is that chelates in the medicines, they're so stable that they get into our soils and they're basically causing a leaching of some micronutrients that normally wouldn't be soluble because they're pulling them out and they're putting them in solution, and we're getting some of the issues with that. So in some countries, some of the chelates are not even allowed, they're being banned. So, but if your question was directed towards foliar, you're right, the stability of it would be limited because of the light. Okay. Would basically denature it and wouldn't be an issue. And when you're growing citrus and avocado, and this is beyond my knowledge, there's a certain window where you can use this and it will get into the foliage because the foliage becomes waxy and impermeable to these chelates, even though I think you can use surfactants and stuff. Yes?
If you have a really sandy soil and you're using a chelated nutrient, is that just gonna wash through?
I don't know. I don't know how far that would go. I honestly don't know. I know in Florida, I think they do have that problem. So, but I don't have information on that, nor did I look it up. So I can't answer it with 100% certainty. So, but yeah, so in some countries it's becoming an issue.
Are they used in like hydroponic systems?
Yeah. They can, but again, if there's light that gets into it, then you have to be careful. So, and the other thing that I want to point out that I really don't get into today, when we talk about water recycling a lot, we'll talk about water recycling in other workshops, is that you have the molecular weight of this molecule. It's a big molecule, and so even though it's soluble and it's in solution, the molecular weights are pretty high. You've got the iron on there plus a 346 molecular weight. And so they're big molecules. So in San Diego especially, some people will filter their waters, right? They'll do, there's different ways to get the salts out of your water, reverse osmosis, or there's ultrafiltration, which actually passes the water, like reverse osmosis, passes the water through a membrane. And the size of the pores of that membrane will keep pathogens out too, if you use a certain type of membrane. So, but if the membrane pores are really small, then your chelates will also get caught. So if you're treating water in your ultrafiltration for disease management or something, then you're gonna filter these out as well. And the same with RO water. There are some growers down here that do RO water for some of the greenhouse stuff. And so you add all this stuff after the fact, right? Because otherwise you're taking it out before you get to the plant. It always sounds like an earthquake. Especially after 5 cups of coffee. Okay. So now we're going to talk about fertilizer in the bag. How do you do it? What does it mean? How do you measure it? You get this report back that says I need this many pounds of nitrogen. How do I get this in the fertilizer? So, on a bag of fertilizer, you're gonna see something. You buy a bag of 20, 20, 20. And one thing I'm gonna point out, there's different types of products, and they all can say 20, 20, 20. But what's gonna be different is what sources of nutrients they're using. So here, in this part, we have total nitrogen, 20%. 1.97% is nitrate nitrogen, and 18% is urea nitrogen. So with just looking at that number, what do you think would happen to the pH? What general range do you think the pH will go up or down?
Down.
Down, okay, good. So here's the available phosphates, soluble potash, magnesium 0.5%, that's kind of normal. Like I said, with the palm specials, it's up to 2.5. Boron, here's copper. And I can tell you, not all the fertilizers have everything in them. I mean, they don't, you can see there's no nickel in here. I haven't seen any fertilizer with nickel. And some fertilizers don't even have boron in them. Even some of the palm specials. And partly, I'm not sure why that is, because we have issues. I think partly it's where it's manufactured, because many people don't have boron deficiency, so the manufacturers don't put it in there. But you just need a little bit. Here's copper, iron. Oh, you can't read it. It's like 0.1. Manganese, no, 0.1%. Manganese, 0.05. Molybdenum, and then zinc. And so here you have derived from boric acid, so boron is from boric acid, copper EDTA, remember the chelate, iron EDTA, okay, manganese EDTA. So this company has used EDTA. So the lower limit is probably 4, because that was all of them, I think. And then the upper limit is probably about 6.5. And then magnesium sulfate, which is very water soluble. Potassium nitrate, potassium phosphate, sodium molybdate, and urea and zinc EDTA. So when you're looking at the quality of a bag of fertilizer, look in here and see where these nutrients are coming from. If it was like magnesium chloride or sodium nitrate, it might be less expensive, but it increases the salt levels of the water more so than some of these other products. So that also contributes to the cost of some of these fertilizers. So there's your bag of fertilizer, and this bag has, in addition to these other things, which are not listed on the bag in this number, this is just N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. So it says it has 20% nitrogen in it, and that's where it's coming from. So how do we calculate how much nitrogen we're getting when we add a pound of this fertilizer? So here's an example. So how much nitrogen is the bag? You have a 100-pound bag of 20, 20, 20. That means 20% nitrogen, right? So we're looking at the first number only. And that's an actual amount. So when they say nitrogen, they mean it's nitrogen. It's not nitrate nitrogen. It's not ammonium nitrogen. It's nitrogen, the actual amount of N. So you just take that bag, 100 pounds times 0.2, because that's 20%. And you have 20 pounds of nitrogen in that entire bag. Okay. Part of that is nitrate nitrogen. Part of that is ammonium nitrogen. But you actually have 20 pounds of nitrogen in there. So if you had a 100-pound bag of 15, 20, 20, again, 15% nitrogen, all you do is multiply 100 times 0.15, and you have 15 pounds of nitrogen in there. And this one is 50 pounds of 20, 10, 20. Okay, we're looking at the first number. So it's 20%, 50 pounds, 50 times 0.2. We have 10 pounds of nitrogen in there. So nitrogen, for a change, is easy to talk about. So let's move on to the other guys. Now let's talk about phosphate. Okay, here's the same, this is the same label. We haven't changed anything. So in the United States, we report our fertilizer as phosphate, not phosphorus. Okay, so in that molecule, right, only a small fraction of that molecule is phosphorus. The rest is oxygen, right? So we gotta take out the oxygen. So this bag has 20% phosphate. So how do we calculate that? Okay, so phosphate, the amount of phosphate in this molecule is 43.43. If I were to add up the molecular weight of oxygen, the 5 oxygen molecules, and the 2 phosphorus molecules, I would end up with 0.43%, or 43% of this molecule is phosphorus. Okay, so then when they say you need 10 pounds of phosphorus, how do you get that out of that bag? So you need to add, if you had a 100-pound bag of 20, again, this is phosphorus, the second number, 20%. You have a 100-pound bag of fertilizer. The percent phosphate is 0.2, is 20%, right? So 0.2. And the conversion for the actual amount of phosphorus is 0.43. So you multiply 100 times 0.2 times 0.43, and you have 8.6 pounds of actual phosphorus in there, okay? You have 20 pounds of phosphate, but 8.6 pounds of phosphorus. Okay, here's another one. 100-pound bags of 2015-20, again, is 15%, so you just do 100 times 0.15 times conversion of 0.43, you end up with 6.45 pounds. Okay. And then example 3, a 50-pound bag of 2010. Again, it's this number we're worried about. So 50 pounds times 0.2 times 0.43, you have 4.3 pounds of actual phosphorus. Okay. Any questions on that one? Okay. Now let's talk about potassium. Okay. So potassium, they're looking at in the United States is potash, K2O. So basically burnt plant material. So potash. So you have potassium in here, K2O. So how much potassium are we getting when we do this? So all we have to do is figure out what percentage of this molecule is potassium, right? Just like we did for phosphorus. So finally corrected this slide after 20 years. So I was sitting here last night in my hotel room, and I'm looking at this, and I had P2O5 on here still. I had cut and pasted, and I had P2O5 in there. Oh God, 22 years. So anyway, because we've been doing this for 22 years, there's always new people. So, so for potash, if you look at this molecule, there's 2 potassium molecules and 1 oxygen, 16, and then I forget what the weight of potassium is. But 83% of that molecule is actually potassium, a little better than the phosphate, right? So if you do a 100-pound bag of 20, third number, 100 pounds times 0.2 times that conversion factor of 0.83, you actually have 16.6 pounds of potassium here. Okay, not 20 pounds, 16.6. We do 20-15, you just do the 100-pound bag times 0.15 times 0.83, 12.45. And then example 3, 50-pound bag of 20-10, we just multiply 50 times that 0.10, because 10% of that fertilizer bag is potash, times the conversion factor of 0.83, we end up with 4.15. Okay? Easy as pie. It's funny how you make analogies of food closer to lunch. And that bear claw has my name on it. I swear I saw it. Okay. So now let's talk about soluble fertilizers, and I think we'll stop at that point, because the control use is different and will require some time today. Okay, so with soluble fertilization, what's going on when you fertilize in a container or in a plant system in the field? Usually less nitrogen volatilization. Nitrogen volatilizes an awful lot. With soluble fertilizer, you get the fertilizer into the soil, and so less is on the surface, and you don't lose as much nitrogen through volatilization. What's nice about soluble fertilizer is that you add it, you know when you're adding it. It's going to be available to the plant when you water the plant. Okay, that's the benefit of having that timing. You know exactly when things are getting the fertilizer they need. The other thing is with soluble fertilizer, it doesn't matter if the roots are contained in this little liner that you just transplanted into a larger container, or if you put it into an established plant. As long as there's interception with the roots, it's going to be taken up, right? So with this, where I'm getting this, and you'll see later, is when you have a granular fertilizer, you put it in this 1 gallon container or something, nothing's going to be taken up here yet. The roots are all still up here. So you have to make sure that you have root interception with the fertilizer. So with liquid feed, more than likely, if you have water going into the root system and you have liquid feed, you're going to get it taken up by the roots. Okay. So the only problem with liquid feed irrigation is that you have soluble fertilizer in there. And if it's water soluble, that means it always can be easily leached out of your system, right? So if you do have soluble fertilizer in your system, and that's what you're working with, you can't irrigate excessively because since the dissolved fertilizers will be easily leached from the medium. So like with field growers, so one of the things you can do, even with the media people when you're growing in larger containers, is you want the fertilizer to get to the water. If you have the ability, what you can do is you can water the system first and get the soil moist so that the water absorbs into the soil better, and then you pulse irrigate. So then you fertilize on that second round, and the fertilizer will move into the soil column better because the soil's already pre-moistened. Because sometimes soils, when they're dry, become hydrophobic. They repel water, and it's really hard to get them wet, especially when you're working with peat, right? Peat's notorious for that. So you don't ever want to fertigate dry peat because you're not going to go anywhere. So that's one of the downfalls of fertigation. Benefit, you know that you're applying the fertilizer when you apply the water. So timing is an understood measurement, but you can easily leach it from your system. And this kind of gives you an example of that. And so let me explain this graph for you. So I did a little study, it was a little study, and I didn't have any plants in this study. What I did was I had just these pots, and I did two things. I did one where I fertigated with 100 parts per million fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer as nitrate, and another group of pots I fertilized with 100 parts per million of nitrogen as ammonia. So nitrate and ammonia, okay? And it was in February in Riverside, so it was the middle of winter. It was horrible. It was like, oh my God, it was 55 degrees. It was terrible. So this is the time on the x-axis from 1 to 29 weeks, and this is nitrate concentration in milligrams per liter on the y-axis, so 0 to 120 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. And this is what I did was I every time I watered, I had 100 parts per million nitrate nitrogen being in here, and I knew what amount was going in. And I had little dishes, and I collected all the leachate that came out. About 25% of the water came out of what I applied. And so this is the leachate, nitrate, nitrogen from the media when I fertilized with that 100 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. And you can see in the beginning that I only recovered about 50 parts per million. The concentration was reduced. So for several weeks, I had half of my nitrate was missing, okay? And then it started to increase, and then I got up to about 100 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, okay? So what happened in the beginning here is the media tied up, I forget what the media was, but it tied up some of the nitrogen. We lost some of the nitrate from the media. It tied it up because it needed it, right? Some of the microorganisms were starting. And so nitrate was tied up in this beginning, and then it started to increase, and then we got up to 100 parts per million at this point. I don't know what happened here. But you can see, so in the beginning, the media was tying up some of the nitrate, and then we had some volatilization going on. So that's what happened in the beginning. So we had part of this was conversion to ammonia. There is some of that going on in the media binding, especially if you have sawdust in the media, nitrogen is going to be used. So that's nitrate nitrogen, right? Now let's do the same thing with ammonia. Same graph, but this time what's different here is it's all ammonia. I didn't use any nitrate. It's 100 parts per million ammonia. So again, though, this y-axis is the amount of nitrate coming off in that pot, from that pot, because nitrate's a big problem in our industry, in agriculture, in the landscape industry, running into the groundwater. So 0 to 120, same scale, and these are the weeks 1 through 28. And this time we did ammonia. And so I collected it and measured the amount of nitrate in the system. Well, there was no nitrate in the system in the beginning. We probably get some ammonium, but we got no nitrate. Why? Well, partly because, people say, if I fertilize with ammonium, I won't get any nitrate runoff. So this is to prove that wrong. But it was cold, it was chilly, our mornings were in the low 40s, so the soils were cool. And the other thing I didn't point out before is the media was sterilized. So, most people have heat sterilization or pasteurization to kill all the pathogens in there, but you're also killing nitrifying organisms. So when the ammonia was put in here, there was no nitrification. So we didn't get any nitrate coming out. But then as the soils warmed up and the soils were contaminated, the media was contaminated with nitrifying organisms, some of that ammonium was converted to nitrate. And so now we start seeing more nitrate in the system, even though I didn't add any nitrate, it was all ammonia. So this is why, if you think that using only ammonia was going to prevent nitrate runoff, this is why you're wrong. Okay, this shows it. So as the media starts getting contaminated with nitrifying organisms, which you want it to do, then you will have nitrification and you'll have nitrate coming out of your system. So we'll stop with the liquid. I'll just give you a couple more slides. So liquid feed fertilizers. Make sure you read the directions in the labels to know the nutrient solubility of the fertilizers, make sure they're compatible. And usually with fertilizer companies, if you work with them, they will work with you and they will tell you what is compatible and what isn't. They have all that taken care of. Fertilizer solubility is going to change with the season. And so fertilizer formulations will often change in winter versus summer, depending on solubility. Check the solubility of the fertilizer in your water, right? And or consult with the representative to see what you are working with, because what you're working with here in San Diego is going to be different from what someone's working with up in Sacramento or up in Eureka, because the water sources are way different. And please be careful because, yeah, I know.
Sure.
I feel the same way. At least it's not my phone for a change. But I honestly don't know where we're going with this drought. I'm just trying to figure things out. I know that the Hoover Dam is down to 30%, and my mind keeps saying the water quality has to be coming different where it's coming up from. So the other day I was at home and I was just like, why am I watering so much? And I thought, I wonder if our water quality's changed, because we get Colorado and Riverside. So I'm thinking, no, maybe the water's getting salty. Maybe they, whatever. So I measured it as my little handy dandy meter, which I'll talk about later. And the water was 0.56, which you all would just love, down here. So our water quality is fine. But I know our water quality changes a little bit when we switch from Colorado to groundwater in Riverside, because we go back and forth each season. So, but these are things we have to think about, and when you get your fertilizer type, make sure your wells, understand what water quality you have coming out of your wells or wherever your water is coming from, because that can impact the solubility of your fertilizers. And then we're going to talk about alkalinity. later with water quality and the irrigation water, and it's an issue. Irrigation practices, drip irrigation in containers is optimum, as most fertilizer will come in contact with the root system, right? And before I came to California, I never thought anyone would have drippers on 4-inch pots until I came here. And I saw cyclamens on 4-inch pots with drip. And I'm like, whoa. And they're like, yeah, when we started in the 80s, we were in a drought. So every drop counted, and we counted for every drop. And I was like amazed, but that's where we are, you know? And here, where water's really expensive and really hard to get, this works, and this is feasible. Overhead irrigation should only be done if water capture and recycling systems are in place. I know a lot of people still overhead water, and there are people still hand water. You know, the ends of blocks of plant material dries out faster than the block in the middle. That's just the way it is. And we don't have the technology yet to correct that without the use of human intervention. So these are things we have to think about. So we did do studies. You know, the state of California was very, very nice to us, and we did a lot of research in Ventura, and we looked at water recycling systems for nurseries, and the cost recovery was faster for a large nursery, like 100 to 200 acres. And it took a little longer for smaller nurseries, like 2 to 4 acres, to recover the cost of installing a recycling system, but it really did pay off because the fertilizer that's running off from your production system in a nursery is about 50%. So when you recapture that and treat it and mix it with water, you're recovering your fertilizer costs, and that's what's paying for the implementation of the recycling system. Equally. Yeah, so we'll stop at that. We're going to take a lunch break, and then we're going to talk about granulars and how they work, and then we'll talk about organics, and then we're going to talk about the water and media, water, oh, and the tissue analysis. Okay, so let's talk about granular fertilizers. We talked about the liquid feed. So there are 3 different types of granular fertilizers, if you want to categorize them. Uncoated granular, which we use like the brown rock or limestone and stuff. Coated granular, which are a lot of controlled fertilizers that are covered with polymer, which we'll talk about. And then organic fertilizers, which are like the ureas and ammoniums. The granular fertilizers, their nutrient release is based on several things. One is the solubility of the fertilizer compound. I talked earlier about that with the iron. And that's the size of the krill. When I worked for one company, they had they figured out what size dolomite to use so that they had that release of calcium and magnesium and pH during a whole year cycle. And so they went to a certain size of granule versus one that's really fine. It was going to get quick change, but it was brief, right? So then there's the release characteristics of the coating. We'll talk about controlled fertilizers. And I'll point out a label so you know what you're reading and how to read the label. So with granular fertilizers, nutrient release is based on temperature. And this graph here is basically an example of a long-term release 365-day controlled release fertilizer, polymer coated, and the y-axis goes from 0 to 100, and that represents the cumulative release. So as the krill releases the fertilizer, you keep adding it, the number keeps going up, right? And so this is the time in months from 1 to 12. And so this is a controlled release fertilizer for, it was at 70 degrees, okay? So if you look at this red line, that's the 70 degrees. And you can see there was a slow release and cumulative release of that fertilizer throughout the 365 days. Now, if the temperature goes up to 90, which in our media, it oftentimes happens, you have the temperature, you have most of the media, most of the fertilizer has been released by 5 months. So you have to look at the label. Different products have developed the controlled release fertilizers based on a different temperature. So you have to know what temperature that is. Down here, it's usually warm. We usually have a problem with releasing too fast. In Northern California, they have the opposite. They have to get something that releases faster at lower temperature because it doesn't get warm. So that's one thing. Release rates increase with increasing temperature and also moisture. The temperature is the driving force for the pollen. And this is a blown-up diagram of the fertilizer bag. And you'll see here they have 12-month heating at 8 degrees. So you know that their product has been tested at that temperature and how long it's going to last. And you can buy products that are 3-month, 6-month, 12-month, depending on what type of crop you're growing and the longevity that you may have before the crop is shipped out or sold. So you look at that, and then also there's the recommended rates for the containers. And then also there's, you'll see here, pounds per cubic yard kind of feeding requirement. Because there are some plants, like a lot of our native plants and ericaceous plants, like blueberries and azaleas, they have ferns, they have a lower salt tolerance, and they have a lower, they have evolved and are very nutrient poor soil. And if you look at blueberries and azaleas and stuff, they're usually on leach soils, organic, but they're not high in nutrients and salts. And so these plants require a lower feeding rate than they'll burn from fertilizers. So if you're looking at azaleas or blueberries or avocados, you would look at a lower fertilization rate than say something you would run in Gustum and faster growing. So usually the labels are pretty complete on these products and what they have. And this number will vary. Some of the products are as low as 72, and then some other products are as high as 86. So you have to be aware of that. And we did a study about 15 years ago when we looked at different product types. And this is a Controlled fertilizer evaluation, nitrate, nitrogen, and leachate, like I was saying before, with the plant and collecting the leachate after we watered it. At this time, the product, the controlled fertilizer, is blended into the media. And so this left graph is Osmocote, this was Multicote, Nutricote, and Mapex. Okay, and we started the study in August. So the x-axis is time, from 0 to almost 50 weeks. And so August was when we planted these up, which was really hot. It was 100 degrees. And you can see that we had this release rate of some fertilizer in the beginning of the study. As in the first 2 weeks, we had some spikes. But then it kind of stabilized throughout the whole year. And usually by the end of the study, we had about 50 parts per million nitrate still coming off of that media. This is without plants, so what we were collecting is what was being released from the fertilizer. So all these products work. You know, some were more variable than others, but there was a release rate throughout the entire pregnant period, even when we canned up in August. But you have to be careful because by canning in August, you're putting plants up when it's really hot out and the media is going to be hot. So you have a risk of having a spike of nutrient release during that time. The other thing is, if you're making up your own media and you're blending the fertilizer, you have to be careful of a couple things. One, just making up enough media that you have to use. If you store it in the pile, it's going to get hot. And when the temperature goes up in that media, the fertilizer is going to come out of the coating. And you're going to lose a lot of that. And then you have sulfur when you go to use that media. Yes?
I just want to mention, I've seen some of the cannabis growers switching over to white pots. And
that makes sense.
yeah, and so they would have to, of course they're doing mostly liquid feed all the time, but if you had a black pot, this whole release curve would be probably a little different because of the heat component, I would assume, as compared to a white pot.
Okay, yeah, these are black pots that we had here. And the white pots, and I know in some of the avocado production, I know I've seen them with white, and then pot and pot to help with the lower temperature. Yeah.
But there is also another issue with white pots. is that light gets into them, and it could interfere. Some roots don't like light, right? Some roots do. Orchids have to have light, but some roots don't like light.
Oh,
And
interesting.
they'll change their how they behave.
I
Oh,
never knew
right,
that.
the phalaenopsis, right, they have them in clear
They
pots.
have them in clear pots because they have to have light.
So they have clear pots? I've never seen that. That's pretty neat.
And if they didn't have clear pots, the roots would grow out over the top of the pot.
Simply light.
And that's a problem, because then you have to move them, and they're all tangled. So this way they stay inside the pot, move them, there's all these things.
Wow.
And you know why they make pots black?
No,
It's UV,
it's outside.
ultraviolet.
Oh, so they don't break down so fast? Oh, interesting. I've seen a lot of new configurations too, to where they have slots that run up and down. I mean,
That's for root architecture to direct the roots and try and prevent the circling.
Interesting.
So, yeah, so keep those things in mind. And yeah, if you have pot and pot, that will help with the temperature reduction. The other thing to keep in mind is that the orientation of the container. We keep talking about this with the canopies too, but in the containers, the northeast side of the pot is going to stay cooler longer. And in the spring, when you have a lot of plants coming out of dormancy in containers, the southwest side is going to start growing first because it warms up first. And so you'll see the pot run out of the pot, you'll see roots growing actively. And then later the northeast side will start growing. But then in the summertime it flips because it's so hot on the southwest side versus the northeast side that it's detrimental to the roots on the southeast west side, and the northeast side is the perfect temperature for many plants. So keep that in mind, and even when you do large containers, 24-inch boxes or larger, when you're placing drippers on things, the one side of the box is going to dry out faster than the other side because of the orientation of the light. And if they're shaded, of course, then that problem is not so severe at all. Okay, so what type of applications can we do with granular? There's many different ways. One is we can do topical, we can do dibble, we can do layered, and we can do blended. I'll go through each one. Here's a topical application. The problem with this is you can get volatilization of nitrogen coming off the top, especially in more humid climates. But what is the other problem with topical applications? Say you're going from a liner and you're canning them up into 1 gallons. So you have that liner in that 1 gallon, or 1 gallon and a 5 gallon. And you do topical, what happens?
Or you're putting fertilizer in areas where there are any roots.
Right. So until there's roots into the media, what's coming down here isn't going to intercept any roots. So depending on how fast that plant grows and the root systems grow, you're not going to always have interception of fertilizer with the root systems. The dibble application is another method that people use, and what they'll do is they'll put the control release fertilizer in the dibble hole, and then as the roots go down, they immediately intercept it. And that's okay for most plants with control release fertilizers, but not granular fertilizers that have no code, because you'll have the fertilizer burn in the root system. So here, the roots grow down, and you intercept those quills. And then as it grows, the only limitation here is you're just in the bottom of that area, and so the roots that grow here aren't going to intercept any fertilizer, just what goes down in here. That's one method. Another method people use. And here's another one. They use this in Florida, so in more humid climates where volatilization is a big issue. They will actually put in the media, put in a layer of the fertilizer, and then put the liner in and put more media in. And so that way they mitigate the problem of volatilization and they get the fertilizer a little closer to the root system, but again, until the roots go into it, that fertilizer is just going to leach out. And there's one other step here that I haven't done yet, and that is they're doing layered media, now different densities of substrates with different porosities to help get a more uniform growth of roots throughout the container because of moisture retention. So they'll do a more coarse media here, less water holding capacity, and then higher water holding capacity going up. So now we're looking at that to try to get a more uniform root growth and more uniform water holding capacity in the container. And that's still coming out in research. So, but you can look at that down the line. We'll be interested to see where they go with this. Okay, blended applications is what most people use. And so this is where you blend everything together in the media, and as the roots intercept those prills, then we have nutrient uptake. Now, for everybody out there, I think who's still listening and getting close to retirement, there are things, if you could develop a prill that only releases fertilizer when the root sends a signal, that would be perfect. And there are things that could be done like pH and stuff. That would be the ideal scenario, right? And it's possible. They have something called smart plastics, which when plastics crack, they have little pearls of liquid plastic and they break and fill that crack. So, you know, looking into the ceramics technology and medicinal aspects of this stuff would be really good in the fertilizer. We have a lot of things going on with medicinal things, so we slow release medicines in our intestines to help slowly release. And so this would be something that would work with fertilizers. But we're not there yet. So there you go. Take
Well,
the,
I mean, ours are polymers.
Yeah.
So they do have holes and pores and
Yeah.
flows and
you can take this home and come up with a new.
Yeah.
But these work well, and they do work well, but you can still not use them correctly. You know, if you go ahead and you water, and you water too much, and when you water, yeah, you can leach that fertilizer coming out of the root zone too. You can come out of the field. So that doesn't mean you can be lazy about watering techniques, right? You still have to have a smart program in how you utilize it. So let's talk about the organic fertilizers. And again, I mean they're based from organic materials, not so much organic, not chemical. So carbon-based compounds, urea, sulfur-coated urea, IBDU, bone meal, blood meal, and guano, those are all organically derived. And their release rates based on microbial activity, temperature, and characteristics of the medium. Organic does not always mean slow release with fertilizers of this nature. Nutrient release rates can be very quick for some of the manures, right? The nitrogen. Now the phosphorus coming from bone meal is slower. It breaks down slowly as it dissolves. But you have to be careful when you're using products that are animal-based in terms of manures, because they have to be composted as well. And if they're not broken down properly, you can get burned on some of these products. Seems like the smaller the animal, the higher likely to get burned. So chicken manure and stuff. So keep that in mind, but those are sources that can be used and if you do an organic production. Uh-oh. Oh, no, it didn't. So quick review. Coated fertilizers, coated granular fertilizers, like polymers. The release availability is based on polymer coating. Sometimes it's the polymer type, and sometimes it's the thickness of that, or both. The granule size is in that polymer, and then compound solubility within the granule. Also keep in mind when you look on the bag, I didn't point this out earlier, but some of the products, only the nitrogen source is coated, and everything else isn't coated. So you have to know if it's all coated, or if it's just a certain part of the fertilizer is coated. Uncoated granular fertilizers are released based on granule size and again compound solubility, and then organic fertilizers is based on microbial activity, breaking down as organic products, and then also media characteristics like the amount of oxygen and stuff in the media. Okay. So with granular fertilizers and the liquid feed, know the growth cycle of your crops. Know when they're actively growing, when they're going to be taking up nutrients. A lot of the temperate plants that are grown in the winter are not going to be taking up nutrients. And then as things are actively growing, they're taking up a lot of water and a lot of nutrients. Plant can plant or can material before hot summer months. You know, that's the ideal world, right? I mean, we all want to do that. But what are we doing in the spring? We're shipping plants. So everybody's going into shipping. But that would be the ideal plan, to can up before the heat comes in. And then do not store unused media anywhere where it's going to get hot. So try to make up as much as you need and then use it up. The other thing is, if you change products, if you change fertilizer types, if you change media, then you need to keep records and you need to put new data on these things to know what's happening. And like you can see in the pH, and we're going to talk, Dr. Spinelli is going to talk about that. With a little Italian accent and a lot more hand action than what I do. So, right?
I'm also substantially better looking.
Okay, and then the other thing is, don't assume that all cultivars are the same. And you may think it may be subtle, it can be really severe. I did a study with camellias, Sasanqua, which is the fall blooming camellia. We had different cultivars, and one variety went through this complete defoliation in the fall after it was done flowering. It started flushing out, usually January, February, in containers, and it would drop all its old leaves. And what's going on? And so all the other cultivars of Sasanqua were fine. Turned out, we did a study and we collected the flower buds, camellia flower buds are really big, and collected the leaves, the yellow leaves, the green leaves, and we did tissue analysis of them. And it turns out we had an ammonium-induced magnesium deficiency. And so everything looked good, but what was happening was the plants would flower in the fall like they normally do. They were great. You could sell them, not a problem. And then what would happen is the flowers would fall off after they were done flowering. The plants looked okay. In January, February, March, when they start doing their first flush of growth in the spring, they needed magnesium. And they were trying to get magnesium and they couldn't. And it turns out that new flush of growth had a demand for all these nutrients. But why magnesium? So it was two things. One, it was that we had a lot of ammonium in our system in the wintertime. And the second thing was, oddly enough, the flower buds were large sinks for the magnesium. So it was pulling a lot of magnesium out of the leaves for the flower buds, but not enough to start inducing a magnesium deficiency symptom in the old growth. But when that new flush of growth came out, that was it. That was all total. And they dropped. And we did all the bud analysis and everything, and that was the one element that showed those fluxes. So it was one cultivar out of 5. I mean, you can pick it out in the field. So don't think that one cultivar is doing well, that they're all going to do well, or if one's doing poorly, they're all going to do poorly. Avocados and citrus, be warned, So with other folks, we have so many other plants, it doesn't matter. But you're dealing with a lot of different things. And what else are you dealing with now? You have different rootstocks, right? So whether you're doing dwarf root, your rootstocks might all be the same, I don't know.
Dusa.
Huh?
Dusa.
Okay.
Pass on Dusa.
So you'll have different ones depending on whether you want dwarf or standard.
Yeah, we had mixed. So,
Yeah. So, and people wonder, wow. I was at the nursery yesterday, and this one lady was looking for a dwarf citrus. I said, "Oh yeah, you gotta look for dragon, flying dragon. Should say flying dragon." She said, "Oh, what does that do?" I said, "Well, that's the dwarf characteristic of the citrus. That's how they get the dwarfness." "Oh, how does that work?" I said, "Well, it has a little root system. It doesn't have a big root system." I said, "Which means if you don't take care of it, it's going to die because you have a smaller root system to deal with. When you have a standard, they have big root systems, and yeah, they get bigger because you've got a big root system." I said, "So that's the only downfall of a dwarf, is that you have to deal with that smaller root system, which is great if you want a small tree, like most of us do, because everybody in Southern California has one orange tree and they want oranges." So there's characteristics, and when you change rootstocks, of course you're going to change, more than likely, the ability of the plants to take up nutrients. Let's see, read labels and directions and make copies for your records. Formulations change, even from the same company. Even when you get product in for bark from the same company, from 1 week to the next, you're going to see differences in the quality. You may get the top of the pile 1 week, and then for some reason 1 week you got the bottom of their pile and you got some slow in there, and it's a completely different product, and you're rolling your eyes. Do not store unused media, it's going to get hot. And collect new data, like I said, when the product changes, and then donate some all posts. Okay. Irrigation water. So, Gerry's going to do it. So there's different things you can look at with the water quality. There's acidity and alkalinity, different things. We're going to talk about that. The electrical conductivity, talk about that. The essential nutrients, we'll touch on that. Non-essential nutrients, we need to point those out because they play a role. And then pathogens, which this plant nutrition person says they're a plant nutrition person, hasn't talked about because he's not a pathologist. So we're going to hit on that a little bit so that you have a more well-rounded program at the end of the day. So here's the water acidity, and that's the concentration of hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions in the water. It ranges from 1 to 14. We all deal with between 4, 5, and 8. Optimum is 4.5 to 7.5, and again, it depends on the plant, right? Effects in soil. If you have a really low pH or high pH, you can actually damage the roots. And then also you can change the nutrient availability that's in the soil. So plant damage and also the availability of those nutrients within that medium. And like I said, the tree growers here that are growing out in the fields have one up on us because they have buffer capacity. So, which kind of mitigates some of the mistakes that we as media people can make when we have a media that isn't buffer capacity. So what is alkalinity? Let's talk about alkalinity because we have these issues here. Alkalinity is the concentration of bicarbonates in water. And you all know you have an alkalinity issue. When you shower at home, it turns white on the panels, glass, because you've got this calcium carbonate buildup. I just had our pool cleaned this year. And it's 1 mule, and it's already getting calcium again. So we add water softener. So potassium chloride and sodium chloride are a little softer than the calcium carbonate, so it doesn't get as hard and it washes off easily. So when it comes to alkalinity, those 2 books we talked about actually have some good tables in them. And so this will give you a table on the alkalinity and what you need to be aware of for your crop. If you're in containers, this is the dissolved chemical concentration, and this is the alkalinity. And if you're dealing with larger pots, you are okay with a higher alkalinity because you can leach it out. If you go into liner production or smaller plants, you're going to have problems with the alkalinity. You have to keep that in mind. And we have tables in there that look about alkalinity tolerance for different crop types. So most people will do acidification of their well water or their water source to get out some of that alkalinity. Okay, don't have to memorize it because you're going to have this. But this is the different ways, and Dr. Spinelli is going to talk about this at some point, right, when you do it a little bit. But these are the different ways of measuring it. You know, I know it gets confusing because everybody has a different way of measuring these units. If you send something off to Europe, they have different units of measure than we do here. So this is a conversion of the different types of ways of measuring alkalinity. Don't have to memorize it. You look too intense at that. So usually less than 1.5. In most cases, you're fine. With alkalinity, this is bad news, above 8.5. I know people are about 3 and they're 6. So. Electrical conductivity is the amount of total dissolved ions in the water. And an EC of 640 parts per million total dissolved solids is, let's see that. I think that's about 1.4. EC of 0.7 is okay. This all depends. If you're starting to add liquid feed fertilizer, then you have to start thinking about this more. This is actually pretty good. You have to watch this, especially if you're adding fertilizer, you're up to 3. And then above 3, it's really dangerous. You're going to have problems. Of course, these numbers are going to change, you know, and these numbers in terms of their worriosomeness, I guess, it's going to be more detrimental in the summertime than in the wintertime when we have the rains and we have better water sources.
Are you talking about electrical conductivity of soil?
Of the water.
Or, okay.
Of the water. And then crop sensitivity, fertilization method, like I said, if you're using control these fertilizers, you can get away with a higher range. If you're using liquid feed, you can't. Gerry, this might be a good time for you to talk about the ways of measuring re-irrigation water for EC, right? We're going to do what? Irrigation EC and
I was gonna do nitrate in water.
nitrates in water.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me zip on down. This is an example of a nutrient analysis of water, and you can see it gives the different levels of calcium and magnesium and potassium in water, and also the anions. So if you're looking for a different lab and you're trying to figure out what kind of lab to use, if you use what, labs are not regulated, so you got to be careful sometimes in some of your labs. Waypoint, these numbers should be pretty close. The amount of cations and anions should be the same because there can't be a charging in water, so to speak. So these numbers should be close, which this one is. So you have a measure of your water quality with this. It gives you nitrates, phosphates, bicarbonates, and some of these will also give you recommendations of whether you need to assert. The other thing is not just about the plant, right? With alkalinity and calcium buildup, carbonates, it's in your lines. If you're on drip and such, you're going to run into problems with clogging too. So that's another issue. It's basically the actual physical problems associated with calcium carbonate. And so sodium absorption ratio, again, is for the two of you, because I'm going to pick you out, because it's not an immediate issue. It's never an immediate issue. Sodium absorption ratio is the amount of sodium in water relative to the amount of calcium and magnesium. And it's sodium adsorption ratio. And what this means is when you have a high sodium adsorption ratio, this water will get into your soil and it will cause clay particles to disassociate with each other. And so you have an impermeable soil. So it only happens in clay soils, right? So we don't have clay soils in India. We don't use that. So a lot of companies will throw this number in there because they're measuring sodium, magnesium, and calcium in it. So it's an easy calculation. So, but if you're in containers, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're out in the field, yeah, you do. Yeah, you have to see that. And if it's off and you're having permeability issues, this can be resolved. So. Okay. Sodium concentration. Sodium is not an essential nutrient, but sodium is in our waters. So we have to be aware of it, and if it's high, then we have to find ways to mitigate it. Sodium can be toxic into plants. You have the sodium burn. You see that a lot with avocados on the tissue, the outside tissue. And this is the range for overhead. And you can see there's differences between overhead and in the water in the soil itself. And when you have overhead irrigation, and you have things like calcium carbonate and sodium, you can get water spots on plants. Water spots on ornamental plants doesn't make them so ornamental. So it doesn't sell very well. So you have to make sure you have that resolved. It's an aesthetic thing with overhead, and then it becomes more of a cultural thing in the soil. And chloride concentration is also can be an issue. You can have chloride toxicity on plants. So we treat with chlorides to kill pathogens. And so you do have to monitor that to make sure your chloride level is not too high when it reaches the irrigation hooks. Overhead, the range is about less than 100 parts per million is okay. If you're on surface, it can be a little higher, at 140 parts per million. So again, it depends on your method of irrigating. And then boron, I think we discussed boron enough. So we know that avocados and oranges are sensitive. Sunflowers and lupines are less sensitive. Lemons and blackberries are very sensitive. So I think you said you had lemons too.
Mhm.
Yeah. So there's differences there between the different citrus varieties. And then, so what can you do at home? So this is where I think you can step in, Dr. Spinelli. And so there are things you can do at home. And why did we decide that these are the things you can do at home? Because the equipment is affordable now. It's portable. It's much better than it used to be. A lot of the equipment used to break down relatively quickly, but the technology has really improved. And so there are things you can do. You can measure pH, EC, nitrate, sodium, potassium, and calcium with different types of electrodes. And so Dr. Spinelli is going to talk about that. And,
Somehow.
Huh?
Partially.
Partially. And then you're going to take a break from me.